All right, we're here with Richard Deitsch from Sports Illustrated. You are the media critic there. How important in these days in the Twitter world is media criticism in the sports realm?
It's a good question. I don't know where to look right now. It's just fast. I'm just looking at you. Well, I think it's important because we do need gatekeepers, I think, to help us understand like how the sports media business works. So one of the things I really like about my job is I try to provide viewers and readers with the story behind what they're seeing. And that's whether it's why a certain on-air person is chosen, why a certain on-air person says something, why a producer has chosen something. And I think, at least I do, I cover it the way you would cover any news beat. I think it's as interesting, or it might not be as important as politics, but I certainly think it's as interesting. And I think the viewer is entitled a lot of times to know, not a lot of times, the viewer is entitled to know why things are on the air as they are on the air. So I approach it in the same way like a Washington correspondent would approach the White House.
You and I talked for the first time on Twitter over Craig James, which is a frequent topic of your Twitter feed.
True.
How do you feel ESPN's relationship with Poynter has worked out? And specifically, it almost seems as if Poynter has become a mouthpiece for ESPN, and that's just my take. But
I don't think I would go that far because I think that's unfair to Poynter. And I know the people who do the review project, and I think their heart is in the right place. What I would say is I think they, certainly when it came to Craig James, they absolutely abdicated their responsibility. They promised essentially to do a column on that, and whatever we are, 200 days later, that column hasn't happened. It's probably not going to happen now because James is long gone from ESPN. I think if I had a criticism of Poynter, I think in general they've just been a little late to the draw with some of the issues at ESPN, and I think they've focused on some things that are, I mean, you might agree with me, just things that are not as important to the viewers and readers of ESPN than other things are. They were fantastic when it came to the Jeremy Lin stuff. They were right on point. They filed within 2 days after the Lin stuff happened, and I think they really gave readers and viewers like a behind-the-scenes look at what's happened to why that happened at ESPN. A couple times they've just focused on some odd things at ESPN, which I think very few people are interested in. So I would say that their tenure is mixed. But I understand why some people have called them a mouthpiece because they haven't been nearly as critical of ESPN as Leanne Schreiber was, an ombudsman from a couple of years ago. And you do wonder, and I think it's a fair question, like how much is ESPN... how much of what Poynter has done is ESPN taking? Like, are they really using some of their suggestions, and are they changing up, or is it just a glorified position so ESPN can say, hey, we have an ombudsman?
And speaking of ESPN, it seems like they've completely bought into the Skip Bayless screaming sports writer, which they pretty much started that with Pardon the Interruption, but now everywhere you turn on ESPN, it's hard to not see a screaming sports writer at some point. Is there any turning back? I mean, is there any getting back to outside the line stuff that actually matters, or E60? I know they promote that, but I think it's hard to focus on the positives of ESPN because there are so many negatives.
Well, I will say this. We've crossed the Rubicon when it comes to the screaming sports writers. I mean, we're not going back from that. And there are people, whether it's Skip Bayless or Rob Parker, who have made a career out of being contrarians or basically shouting something to the point where you will get attention for the shout. I will say, though, that I do think that Outside the Lines and E60 remain really good journalistic places, very thoughtful, smart work, and I don't think ESPN is going to abandon that. What I've always argued when I've written, and what frustrates me, is the amount of press and the amount of attention that the screamers get far outweighs the great journalism that they do. And I don't know if that's a product of ESPN PR or it's a product of maybe we as a public are attached to screamers. But I'm more disappointed than disgusted with some of the Baylessization of ESPN because I think ESPN has the power, has the money, and has the brand to be smarter than that. And I want them to be smarter than that. And when I see it, when I watch First Take, and when I see these nonsensical faux debates, who's more famous, Tim Tebow or Jeremy Lin? That's not even a debate. Is Jeremy Lin the new Tim Tebow? I mean, it's just sort of these calculated, inauthentic debates to basically try to attract social media attention or to try to, gin up the ratings. And I'd like to think ESPN's better than that. Maybe they're not, but my hope is that they can be better than that. Their argument would be, we're a big shop, we do 50 different things, you get 50 different choices of ice cream. That's just one choice. What
do you look for in a good commentator? You write the commentator grades every year. What do you look for personally?
I look for someone who is knowledgeable, who's smart, who's thoughtful, who has clearly done the research, who comes from a place of authenticity. I think it's when, especially commentators who are building themselves as journalists, I think you have to get out into at an arena and talk to athletes rather than talk at athletes. That would be a criticism I have of Skip Bayless. When is the last time the guy's actually been in a locker room to actually see what it's like to cover a game after the fact? It's been, I'm sure for Bayless, it's been a long time. I just want, as a viewer, for you to have my back. Maybe you can't be agenda-free, but I want you to be as close to agenda-free as possible. So I want to believe that you as a commentator are telling me what you believe because it's what you believe, and not because of who you're friends with, and not because ESPN owns the rights to the SEC. It's because you honestly believe that. And I think viewers are smart enough to know who those people are, and viewers are also smart enough to know who's basically just shilling and selling for people out in the sports world.
We're shooting this one day after the brackets were announced, and that's the time when Gus Johnson's name was made. I know he's no longer covering it, but where do you stand on Gus Johnson? He's kind of a lightning rod in terms of, you have some people who say he sucks, and some people who think he's the greatest thing.
Cold-blooded. I think Gus is great for the tournament. I mean, I think he adds an incredible amount of fun. It's a frenzied atmosphere. It's kind of a frenzied production, and I think in a one-game kind of element, I think Gus is great. I'm living in New York. I used to hear him on the Knicks games, and I don't like 82 games of that kind of stuff. It eventually, at least for me, wears on it. I think it becomes too catchphrasey, too over the top. It becomes, to me, a little bit shticky. But for the tournament, which essentially is, let's say, for Gus's sake, is essentially a 4, 8, 12 game kind of tournament, very short in time, I think Gus is fantastic. And I think he's incredibly exciting when it comes to end-of-game stuff. I'm still, the jury for me is still out with him when it comes to college football. I don't think he's bad. I don't think he's great. I think he's sort of still getting better. But as an NCAA basketball announcer, I think he's good. I do understand both sides. I know the people who love him and think he's incredibly exciting, and I get that. And then I also get the other side of the people who think he's just way too over the top when it comes to over-dramatizing stuff.
What's your daily media routine?
It's a good question. I try to read and consume as much as I can. I'm probably reading, I would say conservatively, hundreds of stories a day. And even if in some cases it's cursory reading on some, I really just want to feel, weirdly enough, I want to feel overwhelmed in my consumption, because I think that ultimately gives me a pretty good sense of what the marketplace is like, what's going on in the media, and it makes me an educated consumer. The one thing is, and I know because you follow me on Twitter, is I just don't read sports. I really make it a point, especially on my Twitter feed, to tweet out interesting things that are politics, news, global stories, interesting op-eds. I don't have just one interest. I'm not just a sports person, so I don't want my social media streams just to be sports as well. And I would also argue that by reading and having interests in media away from sports helps me as a thinker, as a critical thinker when it comes to writing about the sports media. So I'd absolutely recommend, whether you're on Twitter, following the BBC or The Economist and The New York Times, because I really just think it makes you more of a well-rounded reader.
And finally, we're starting to get into the ramping up of football season. Are you excited about all the renewed Tim Tebow coverage coming up?
Well, it might be Peyton Manning coverage based on what I read in Denver. Tebow's story is fascinating. I think he as an individual is really interesting, and I think he ultimately turned out to deserve the coverage. Where my criticism was on ESPN was that early on, I think they were absolutely dictating the story, and they were creating segments essentially just so that they could.
For shows.
Yeah, for shows, so that they could promote their own shows, sort of using Tebow as the catalyst or the driving point. But he's interesting. I mean, he's an interesting guy who I really think believes what he believes. He's interesting in that he's non-conventional and that he's thrown a lot of the traditional scouts sort of for a loop because he won games last year that I didn't think anybody would win, or that they didn't think he would win. But yeah, I mean, the NFL is king in this country, and with Peyton Manning as a free agent and moving, and coaching changes, I think it's going to be a good year. And the fact is, the Giants are an interesting team as they defend their title. And New Orleans, I believe, is the Super Bowl this year, which is always a great city to have a Super Bowl. So I am excited about the NFL, but I'm also excited about college football. Being in Austin, Texas, I'm very much looking forward to the college football season.